One of my favorite scripture passages is in Exodus 19. We're making our way through the story. We are up to the book of Exodus, and the people of Israel have just reached Mount Sinai. And I love the power that is in this passage. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain, and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. As the blast of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses would speak, and God would answer him in thunder. There's two reasons I read that passage. Number one, it's in Exodus and it fits our theme today. Second, the lights, for whatever reason that I'm using today, just keep flashing. I've tried this starting it over again 5 times. Here we are. The lights are flashing. Whenever you hear this, hear the phrase, Moses spoke, and God would answer in lightning and thunder. So these aren't my lights that are flashing. If you see a flash, stop and go, oh my goodness, what is God saying to me right now? Right? Well, in the midst of all this coronavirus, in the midst of violence in our streets, I read a statistic somewhere that like 68% of people believe that God is trying to tell us something. You think? God is always speaking to us. The problem is on our end, listening. What is God saying in the midst of this season? What is God saying in the midst of your life right now? Whenever you see those lights flicker today, and hopefully it does it only once or twice, but take it as a sign that God wants to open your hearts and have you listen more deeply. So, here we are. They arrive at Mount Sinai. Moses speaks. God answers in thunder. Moses goes up on the mountain, and when he does, remember what he gets? The 10 Commandments, the beginnings of the law of God. Now, I don't know about you, but for many years I had a hard time. I could probably get all of the commandments if I sat down and thought about it, but I came up with a system that helped me remember. I sometimes teach it to our kids, encourage them to draw the commandments in their own way so their own images stick. But here are the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Right? No, I'm number 1. Number 2, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That word vain made me think of a weather vane. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in goofy drawing, but weather vane. Number 3, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Swiss cheese. 4, honor your mother and your father. 5, thou shalt not kill. Right? No murder. 6, thou shalt not commit adultery. 7, thou shalt not steal. 8, thou shalt not bear false witness. 9 and 10, at least in the way Lutherans count, which is different than almost anybody else, but at least in the way Lutherans count, 9 and 10 are both coveting commandments. You should not covet this, number 9, and you shall not covet that, number 10. So, That leaves us, though, if other ones are people are grouping 9 and 10 into commandment 10, we're missing one, and it's actually commandment 2. Thou shalt not make for thyself a graven image. Or my simple way of saying it is, thou shalt not worship false idols. Okay, so here are our 10 commandments. I love what Martin Luther did with these 10 commandments. Martin Luther kind of took these commandments and he turned them upside down. Instead of thou shalt not, he said, thou shalt. And instead of whatever we weren't supposed to do, he turned it to the opposite. So let me give you an example. Instead of thou shalt not kill, it was thou shalt help others live more fully. Isn't that wonderful? We should help others live more fully. Maybe commandment 8. Instead of thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt build others up. Some of my favorite people in this world have the spiritual gift of encouragement. No matter what you do, they're there to find something good that you have done and encourage you along the way. Instead of thou shalt not covet, maybe it's thou shalt rejoice in the blessings of others. Instead of going, they got a new car. They're getting a new, bigger house. Maybe we should say, wow, look how God is blessing them. God is active and alive in this world. Thanks be to God for their blessing. One of my favorites to turn upside down is, instead of thou shalt not commit adultery, how about this one? Thou shalt commit marriage daily. I love that. What if we lived our lives with that positive sense? We would transform this world. Today we're going to make our way through the book of Exodus, which is part of the story. Now, you've heard me begin to tell the story today, and it starts with usually this question. We as humans, remember God created, we uncreated. And so, but our tendency is to scapegoat God and say, if only God had done this, if only God had done that, if only we, and usually we means I'm on board, how come you're not, with whatever I think the we should be, okay? And so here we are. What we've heard so far is, if only God had created everything perfect. God says, I did. But perfect didn't work. If you create beings that are not God, by definition, they will eventually sin and fall short. And if you give them free will. Number 2 was, if only God had created everything like one big happy family. God says, I did, but in that first family, Cain killed Abel. Next one, Noah. If only God, this world is so bad, if only God would just start all over again. God says, I did. But when the most only righteous man in all the world got off the boat, he planted a vineyard, got drunk, lay naked, and humiliated his family. Okay? Next one. If only we could learn to work better together. We could solve all the problems in the world. God watched them and saw how they began to think that they were gods or like God. So he scattered them. Okay? We are up now to the book of Exodus. Now, in this book of Exodus, we have 2 of them that we want to focus on, but I'll get to them when we get there. But you remember the story, right? It says in chapter 1 of Exodus that a new king arose who did not know Joseph. All right, so we got to set this up from our previous story. Joseph, son of Jacob, who was renamed Israel. So Joseph is the son of Jacob / Israel. He is sold into slavery, but God has given him the ability to interpret dreams. He interprets a dream for Pharaoh about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, 7 years of of plenty, then 7 years of famine. In the years of plenty, store up, for the years of famine are coming. They did precisely that, rescued them. Joseph rises to second in charge of all of Egypt. And his family, the Israelites, come now and live with Joseph, and he takes care of them. But years and years and decades and centuries pass. And, chapter 1, verse 8 in Exodus, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, they may join our enemies and fight against us and escape from this land." So they made them slaves. All right? They persecuted them further. Pharaoh said, and here he was, and this part is so crucial to understand. Pharaoh had fear. Okay? Pharaoh was afraid. If an enemy comes, they're going to join with the enemy, they're going to fight against us, things are going to be bad. Pharaoh had fear. Okay? So here is Pharaoh, and what does he do? He makes them slaves, and he starts killing their children, their boy children. No boys grow up, no soldiers in an army. That is Pharaoh's. I love that there were two midwives there named Shiphrah and Puah who decided they were going to listen to God instead of react in fear to the man of this earth. I love that piece of the story. And so, but here is Pharaoh's fear. I remember years ago reading one of the first theological books I read. The theologian said that fear is often the first step into sin. It readies us for sin. If a bear jumps out in front of you, fear is not a sin. But it's what we do with that fear. And it caused Pharaoh to become murderous, enslaving of others. So here the people now are slaves. Their children are being killed. The mother of Moses has a little baby. She's afraid for her baby. She puts him in a basket, floats him down the river. Of all people, you think this was coincidence? Remember what Pastor Conda said a moment ago, God incidents. Moses is brought into the home of Pharaoh, found by Pharaoh's daughter. Needs a wet nurse and nursemaid, and so who comes in but Moses' mother? Can't you believe that she sang him songs of her people and taught him stories that sunk into him a love of the Hebrews even before he had a sense of calling for his destiny. So, chapter 1 begins, a new king arose that did not know Joseph, and then the second, we come to God is beginning to raise up a deliverer. But God waits until the end of chapter 2, verse 23. After a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites finally groaned under their slavery, and finally cried out. I added that word finally, but that's, I think, the intention here. Out of their slavery, their cry for help, though, rose up to God. God heard their cries and their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That gift of when we cry out, we have a God ready to listen to our cries. And so when they finally cried, the first words of the next chapter were Moses. Or we could say the first words of the next chapter were deliverer. They cried, and God already had in place a plan for delivery. He began raising Moses up maybe 60 years before, right? Finally, they cry, and the deliverer is ready. So God comes, and he begins to speak to Moses from a burning bush. And in the midst of that burning bush, we hear the phrase, Moses, Moses. He cries out, here I am. God says, Moses, take off your shoes, for you are standing on holy ground. God invites him closer to turn aside. And when Moses comes closer, God gives him a charge. I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him to let my people go. All right? I did an ordination just a week or two ago. I preached the sermon, and one of the passages that the brand new pastor chose for the day was from Isaiah chapter 7. It was in the year that King Uzziah died. I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. By the end of the passage, the seraphs and God are calling, whom shall we send? And Isaiah, with bold words, says, here am I, send me. Don't you love that? Here I am, Lord. Just that beautiful sense of, here I am, send me. So God comes to Moses, the bush is burning. Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh, and I want you to tell him to let my people go. And Moses says boldly, here I am. Oh, he's speaking again, isn't he? You better pay attention to this one. Moses says, here I am, send Aaron. Moses didn't want to go. He didn't want to confront a king. Being a prophet is a lousy job. So the priest Aaron went along with Moses. They went to Pharaoh. They said, let my people go. That's what God says. God says, let my people go. And what do you think Pharaoh said? Pharaoh said no. Now, I'm going to totally oversimplify this because we've got a long way to go and a short time to get there, right? I'm going to totally oversimplify this, but in general, this is how the story went. Moses would go to Pharaoh and say, God says, let my people go, and Pharaoh would say, no. And so Moses would say, flashing, you better pay attention to this, Moses was saying, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have said no. Now God's going to have to give you a sign to show that he truly is God. And so God would give a sign. Pharaoh would get freaked out and he'd say, go. But as soon as God would take away the sign or the plague, he'd change his mind and say no. Okay? So it was, God says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. There's a plague. And he says go, but then he says no. All right, you know the pattern. It's oversimplified. But here's the cool part of this that I love. In chapter 12, God specifically articulates that these plagues were judgments against all the people of Israel. Let me say that again. These were all judgments against all the gods of Egypt. These were judgments against the God of Egypt. So, if you live in a desert culture, what is probably the most important thing for you? It's water. The Nile was the source of life. They believed that their God not only came from the Nile, but lived in the Nile. And so, Mr. Creator of the universe, whose symbol was the Nile River and water and life, what is God's first plague? He turns the water into blood. What was God's second plague? It was frogs. Why frogs? Because the symbol of Mrs. Creator of the universe was frogs. It was judgment against her. And then it was judgment against Egypt's priests. Because if you remember old pictures of Egyptians, they would shave their heads and every piece of hair on them. Why? Because they didn't like lice. They were super freaked out about that. And so what's the third plague? It's lice. All the way through here, there are plagues and judgments against the people of Israel. The livestock got sick. It was a plague against the God of the livestock. It was a plague against the God of healing because the people got sick. They got boils all over them. It was a plague against the God of agriculture. First there was hail, and then there were locusts. It was a plague against the sun god. There was now darkness. And every time Moses is coming and saying, God says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. Moses says, you shouldn't have done that. The plague comes, Pharaoh says, go, and then he changes his mind, no. And then the final plague. The plague and the judgment against the people of Egypt themselves. Okay? It was what's called the Passover. It was the death of the firstborn. This was a judgment against Pharaoh himself, who I'm sure thought of himself as a god. Remember how he killed all, or wanted to try and kill all of the male children of Israel? God gave him the judgment that fit his actions. It was, and tempered back, it was the firstborn sons that were killed. But for the people of Israel, God gave a blessing. God gave a rescue plan. Take a lamb. This is chapter 12, the institution of the first Passover, as well as the proclamation to proclaim this throughout their ages. And so God comes to them and he says, take a lamb. And what I want you to do is to sacrifice that lamb. And I want you, in the midst of this, to put its blood above the door. And when death comes to the land this night, I will pass over you. Now, if you missed it, if you've ever missed it, this was an incredible prefiguring. The blood of the Lamb. And Jesus was the fulfillment of all of this. Remember the first time John the Baptist met Jesus, he said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. It is his blood that will be shed for us. Essentially, figuratively, not just put over our doorposts, but over our hearts. And God will save us in the end when death comes for us. So the people of Israel are free. And they go out into the wilderness. Pharaoh finally, this time, says go, and he finally means it for a day or two. And the people go off into the wilderness. And when they go off into the wilderness, Pharaoh, of course, changes his mind. And when Pharaoh changes his mind, he sends his army after them. And the people there are looking. They're at the edge of the Red Sea. They see the hills above them, chariot after chariot's coming after them. They start grumbling to Moses, oh, that we had only stayed in Egypt, where we had food even though we had to work hard. Oh, you've killed us by coming out here. And then God, through Moses, parts the Red Sea. Oh, they come to the other side of the Red Sea, and it is glorious. They sing a praise to God, and first in chapter 15, it says that Moses sings a song of praise. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. And he sings for the better part of a chapter. Near the end of the chapter, his sister Miriam, she sings, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider of those Egyptians he has thrown into the sea. And then Moses, verse 22, ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea. And they went into the wilderness of Shur, it says. They went 3 days in the wilderness, and they found no water. And it says, they began to complain against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? And so Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord, isn't this amazing, rescues them. He showed Moses a piece of wood, and Moses threw it into the water, and the water at the springs of Marah became sweet. So, here's our next piece of the story. And I like telling it this way. Have you ever heard anybody say, if only God would just give us a sign, then we would believe? You ever heard anybody say that? God says, I did. I gave the people of Israel 10 signs in a row, and then I parted the Red Sea. See, it's flashing. God wants you to pay attention to this. But the effects of signs and wonders only last 3 days. They march 3 days into the wilderness. They begin to complain against Moses and against God. And we think, how silly is that? They've just seen all the power of God, but we do this all the time in our lives. I take, for example, car accidents. Anybody been in a pretty significant car accident? How many of you for the first couple days are going, you wouldn't believe it. I could have died in that car accident, but God saved me. This was a miracle. This was miraculous. I could have died, but God saved me. By the third day, do you know what people are saying? It's like, my insurance company, they won't pay up. I don't know how I'm ever going to make this work. This is so inconvenient. The effects of signs and wonders last 3 days. And then the next piece of the story, have you ever heard anybody say, if only God would just tell us what he wanted us to do? God says, I did. 10 Commandments, top of Mount Sinai, all of the law unfolded through these next several books. I have told you what I want. But what did the people of Israel do? If only God would tell us, God says, I did. But when I gave you the law, you ignored it for like the first 1,000 years. And then after the exile, when you started paying attention, you became so legalistic that you choked the life out of other people. That's us. We are an absolute mess. And so what I want to do is I want to go back and I want to tell this story in a different kind of way. Anybody admit that we're a mess? First of all, I want to show you a picture. This was my favorite meme when we first went into this shutdown. Suddenly we had to start doing church differently, and for a while it was taking me. It's mainly taken me like 60 hours a week anyway, but some weeks it was 80 or 100 hours a week trying to get these videos, trying to figure out the technology. I thank God for Paul Happel, but we've finally gotten place to do this. But after a week of incredible frustration of having to record the sermon 7 times, it was a mess. And one of our staff members sent me this meme. And I have to set it up a little bit. You remember in Star Trek, the original one, where Bones the doctor, it seemed like once an episode, he'd talk to James Kirk, Captain Jim. He'd say to him, darn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a miracle worker. Well, here's my meme for these last few months, is, darn it, Jim, I'm a pastor, not a videographer. I am so ready to get back to pastoring that I am working ahead now on my sermons. And because I'm working ahead on my sermons, I want to tell you in advance that the examples that I use to make some of these things practical may not be the most pressing issues when we get these, since I'm recording these in advance. But the issues of today, and they're sad ones. We've got 3 crises going on in our world right now. Number 1, we have a coronavirus which has killed so many people, is killing people, and has locked so many people down in fear. Can't go out. We also have the violence. A violent police officer triggered violence all across this nation. And we have a brewing economic crisis. Who knows what's going to happen in the midst of this? Individually, we are all dealing with things. And so here we are. I'm recording this a couple weeks ahead. There's probably going to be a new crisis that's hitting this. But have you ever been able to look at the world and go, oh my goodness, we are in bondage? Have you ever looked at your own life? Addiction is the perfect example of this. And said, oh my goodness, I am in bondage. In chapter 1 of Exodus, it says a new king arose that did not know Joseph. And so he put them in slavery. Step 1 is, and this is going to be a freedom model. How do we gain experience and be set free. How do we gain freedom? And so step number one is to realize that we're in slavery. I mean, how many times, like for an alcoholic, is step number one, you've got to admit that you have a problem, right? Racism in America. What is step number one? We've got to admit that we can't close our eyes and pretend there's not a problem, okay? So step number two, we have to cry out for a deliverer. Okay? That's what they did at the end of chapter 2. They cried out for a deliverer. And the thing that you need to realize is it can't just be a person here, a person there, and a person there. It has to be a collective cry of all of the people groaning under their slavery. If it's within you, it can't just be, well, gee, I sure wish that I could lose a few pounds. That's probably... For some of us who say we don't know addiction, I think we do know addiction. I mean, not to the horrific standards, but we do know addiction with food, don't we? Most of us. How many of you ever said, I want to lose a little weight, and we can't just go, I wish I could lose some weight and just go off and eat a pizza. We have to cry out with everything in us, don't we? I have a friend who has lost 50-some-odd pounds in these last few months. It started with that cry of everything in them that says, I need an answer, and I'm willing to accept that answer. Whatever that is, I'm willing to change. Okay? That's that cry of everything. You know, in the midst of our racially divided nation, we've heard an outcry. I'm recording this. You're going to get this 2 weeks later. Have we risen to the standard? Or is it kind of faded away? Issues tend to come and go. We were outraged. We know it's a problem. But are we there still? Okay. Third step. First words of chapter 3 is a deliverer. Moses raised up. God raised up Moses. And the cool part of God raising up Moses is he started raising up Moses 60 years before Moses ever came on the scene as a deliverer. God was working for their salvation ever before they cried. Whatever is burdening you, whatever is burdening our culture, God has an answer. But we have to cry out and open ourselves to it. But God has a plan. And I started doing this. I called it the freedom model years ago when I came up with this, and I love it. It's very simple. It is, we realize that we're in bondage, admit that we have a problem, admit that we're alcoholics or whatever it is. Number 2, we cry out with everything in us, that cry that's willing to change. Number 3, God's going to be there to help us be free. Isn't that great? You see that flash? God says, that's a great plan, but then I realize there's one more step. We got to walk it out. How long did it take them from Egypt to the freedom of the Promised Land? It took them 40 years to walk it out. They could have left Mount Sinai. It says this in Deuteronomy 1:2, that it was an 11-day journey from the backside of Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, which is essentially on the verge of the Promised Land. It's on this side of the river. We haven't crossed into the freedom yet, but it was an 11-day journey. How long did it take them? 40 years. We got to walk it out. I've known people who have been convicted in faith and have never wanted another drink, but it's not that way for most people. Most people have to walk it out day by day. How many alcoholics go to a meeting every single day of the week? I loved it. We had one of the guys that helped start Alcoholics Anonymous here at our church, passed away recently, but before that had just celebrated his 50th anniversary of sobriety. And he was there every week to keep himself strong and to bless others. He had to walk it out day by day. Remember my friend that I said came up with, I want to lose weight, is down 50 pounds? How many of you know that you got to walk that out every single day? No cheating, great discipline. Okay? We got to realize we're in bondage. We got to want to change. We got to cry out. God will be there with us in the journey, but we've got to walk it out. I'm recording this a couple weeks in advance, as I said. And because of that, I'm curious to see, even 2 weeks from now, how we as a nation are walking out the social justice issues over the killing of George Floyd. Or are we like the people of Israel, that they saw 10 plagues in a row, they saw 10 miracles, then God parted the Red Sea, but it only took them 3 days walking in the wilderness to start complaining? Where are we at now? You can answer that. I'm talking into the future. You can answer that. Have we forgotten it? Has it been, boy, that was bad, but we're on to other things now? Or are we going to walk out change in our world? This is where we are at. This is the pattern in Exodus. But I want to tell you one more piece of the story. If you've ever started reading the Bible, starting at the beginning and trying to go through, you begin to get bogged down at the middle of Exodus. I mean, up until they're given the 10 Commandments, this is a great story, but now we begin to bog down because there are the minute details of building the tabernacle. You ever been bogged down there? Everything, you have to tell them how many stitches and what kind of emblems go on the curtains and what the gold should do. And fortunately, the gift of the Holy Spirit was given to Holiab and the other guy that was there, and they're able to do what God requires. But here's the point. At just precisely the time we get bogged down, we sometimes miss the main message. The message of the temple or tabernacle, the temple in the desert, was that God was with us. God is with us. The ultimate tabernacle is Jesus himself. Everything in the first tabernacle points to Jesus. Remember the poetic way that John tells the coming of Jesus the Messiah? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was with God. And the Word became flesh and tabernacled, dwelt among us. God has set himself in the midst of our lives, in the midst of our broken communities. When we cry out with everything in us, the message of the tabernacle is that God is here. He is with us, to love us, to heal us, to forgive us. God is here, and he hears your cries. He hears them.